welcome again, everybody. Hope you had a chance in breakout rooms to chat with some nice folks and continue to get to know each other. We are going to turn our attention to the first of the Heschel essays that I hope we will spend a good amount of time going through together. And we'll dedicate our learning tonight in the memory of Oded and Shiri and Ariel and Kafir. I'm going to share screen.
Rabbi, the link in the email that you sent didn't work.
Which link was that?
The title that said, "What manner of man is the prophet?"
Interesting, because I got to this off of that link, so not sure what might have happened, but you have it up on the screen, and I will resend it afterwards.
Thank you.
My apologies. So Abraham Joshua Heschel received his PhD in Berlin in 1934. His doctoral dissertation was called Prophetic Consciousness and took a couple of years to find a publisher. It was eventually published actually in Poland in 1936. The doctoral dissertation would then be rewritten into the form of a book called The Prophets in 1962, often published in two pretty considerable volumes. It is not one of Heschel's easier reads. It's quite dense, as you might expect from something which began as a doctoral dissertation. But the first chapter is really the summation of his argument. And as we heard last session, the set of ideas about what the prophets of Israel call us to do that set Heschel on a trajectory from primarily centering his life in his study to feeling the call to be part of the movements for social change in his day, to be out on the streets arm in arm with luminaries like Dr. Martin Luther King and Father Daniel Berrigan, and to dedicate a tremendous portion of the later part of his life to serving as an activist and role model for Jewish involvement in the pursuit of justice. This essay, What Manner of Man is the Prophet, is, I think, one of the most powerful spiritual texts of the 20th century. It's one that I go back to quite often, and one that I teach from in my Introduction to Judaism class. So quite a few of you here are alumni of that class. And so the first part of this text might very well seem familiar if you can recall all the way back to whenever it was you took that class with me. But there's a lot more here than the little snippet that I bring to the intro class. So we're going to start together and we're going to read this slowly as befits a sacred text. And we're going to talk about it as we go. I will pause at various times with questions and invitation to conversation. But you should also feel free to hop in with your own comments, either in the chat or by using the raise hand function, so that I can see you, because I can only see a small number of you on the screen at a time while I've got the text up. So use the raise hand function or hop into the chat at any point. What manner of man is the prophet? What manner of man is the prophet? A student of philosophy who turns from the discourses of the great metaphysicians to the orations of the prophets may feel as if he were going from the realm of the sublime to an area of trivialities. Instead of dealing with timeless issues of being and becoming, of matter and form, of definition and demonstrations, he is thrown into orations about widows and orphans, about the corruption of judges and affairs of the marketplace. Instead of showing us a way through the elegant mansions of the mind, the prophets take us to the slums. The world is a proud place, full of beauty, but the prophets are scandalized and rave as if the whole world were a slum. They make much ado about paltry things, lavishing excessive language upon trifling subjects. What if somewhere in ancient Palestine poor people have not been treated properly by the rich? So what if some old woman found pleasure and edification in worshiping the Queen of Heaven? Why such immoderate excitement? Why such intense indignation? Heschel begins by setting up a binary comparison between prophets and philosophers. He says that prophets and philosophers are fundamentally interested in different kinds of questions. What is the kind of question that interests a philosopher, according to Heschel in this passage? What's a philosopher's question? You could put a philosopher's question in the chat. You could raise your hand, or you could even just unmute yourself and hop in with a philosopher's question.
Seems like the philosopher is talking about the big picture, like definitions and bigger picture, whereas the prophet is down to the nitty gritty of mankind or womankind, people kind.
So Heschel says that a philosopher is interested in a macro view, the nature of reality. Luciana, who knows a thing or two about philosophy, writes in the chat, why are we here? What is our purpose? Henrietta says, what does it all mean? Luciana says again, what makes a good human being? Diane says the difference between the abstract and the concrete. These are big macro questions. The philosopher is interested, or the prophet rather, is interested in seemingly micro questions. They make much ado about paltry things, lavishing excessive language upon trifling subjects. And we tend, just in those words, big and small, to assign a value to those things. Big is important. Small is less important. The big questions a philosopher tackles about definitions and demonstrations, being and becoming matter and form, are important because they are the great questions. The little things, the small stuff that we're not supposed to sweat, says contemporary wisdom, is what scandalizes the prophets. And so it seems that prophets are interested in things which are, or would seem to be, less important than the things that a philosopher is interested in. What Mimi says, the prophet focuses on the individual. Right? So a philosopher might be addressing a whole society or even the nature of reality. And the prophets are particularly interested in individuals. What if somewhere in ancient Palestine, there are some poor people who haven't been properly treated by the rich? What if some old woman worships the Queen of Heaven rather than Adonai? Why such immoderate excitement? Why such intense indignation? What does any of this really add up to? What do you think Heschel means when he says, instead of showing us a way through the elegant mansions of the mind, the prophet takes us to the slums? We've been talking about big and small. Now we're talking about rich and poor, or powerful and not so powerful. What does Heschel mean when he says, philosophers take us to the mansions, prophets take us to the slums? While we think about that, I'm just going to read out some of the things that are in chat. Teresa said, what's funny is that the big questions are things we can't really do anything about, but the small things are things we can act on. Right? Is that phrase, think globally, act locally? That there are tremendous challenges to our world, tremendous injustices that are present, things that are truthfully out of our hands. but it's the little micro things, the things that have to do with the people right in front of us, the people that we can see, that are more concrete and maybe even more real, certainly more actionable. I'm scanning through the chat. I hope that you are too, because people are adding really important things. Diane says, I think he's challenging us to see how important the small issues are and how they can be greatly affected by us. Yes, yes, yes. Beautiful. Anybody want to take themselves off of mute and share what do you think he means by the slums here? Beth says in chat, maybe not the pleasant things. Mansions are pleasant places to hang out. Not so much the slums. Yeah.
Hi. I it's interesting that the mansions of the mind and then the slums of the like what? Like, so the mansions of the mind, it's like that's where we do all of our thinking, but it's like the slums are the real world. And it's like mansions are nice and great, but also like superficial. I guess, like it by comparison, like so it's kind of like I don't know, like positioning philosophers in like kind of like the dilettante camp of like, yeah, we're gonna, you know, think big thinky thoughts, but sit around kind of in our privilege and, you know, whatever. Whereas like he's saying the prophet kind of, you know, is more concerned with the physical, the real, the, you know, connecting with people outside of our comfort.
We talk about the ivory tower, right? The idea of the philosopher as somebody in some beautiful and pure place where they have the privilege of time and ability to think deep thoughts about the meaning of everything. Somebody who is struggling to support themselves and their family, struggling against the forces so much out of our control, maybe doesn't have the time or energy to devote to questions of being and becoming, of definitions and demonstrations. They just need to figure out how they're surviving. Right? The prophet is interested in not being segmented away from the population, but rather enmeshed in the population, not somebody who sits in a place of privilege looking down, but somebody who sits amongst, looking out. Yeah, Diane, please.
I so appreciate the terminology he uses by the word slums, because the first thing that comes to mind is something that's dirty or not pleasing to look at. And sometimes those very things about how we treat each other can be very painful to see how we are not rising to the occasion.
Mm. Mm. I have been enjoying a lot of SNL sketches the last few weeks as we lead up to or led up to this Sunday's wonderful SNL 50 special. And one of my favorites to go back to that never fails to yank me out of some dark mood is Debbie Downer. Remember Debbie Downer? Debbie Downer, classic sketch with Rachel Dratch at the center. They're in the first sketch, and this becomes a series. They are all gathered, a group of friends at Disney World, all having breakfast with various characters walking around. Lindsay Lohan, who is the guest host, is super excited to meet Tigger. And Debbie Downer keeps announcing over this breakfast all of the sad and terrible things in the world, ranging from climate change to the #1 killer of domestic cats being feline AIDS, to an announcement that she just found out that she can't have children. And with each time she makes an announcement, the camera zooms in on her face and goes, wah, wah. and everybody progressively gets up and leaves the table. And this is one of those sketches that has made its way into popular terminology. We all know, and sometimes have been, a Debbie Downer, have been the person who has brought down the party when everybody wants to be in the elegant mansions. And we have said, what about, or somebody else has said, but what about the slums? And the truth is everybody tends to move away from that person. But the prophets insisted that there was a role for Debbie Downer. Yeah, Rabbi Thunberg.
Oh, there I am. Thanks, Rabbi Adam. This question about mansions of the mind and going to the slums makes me think of Tevye, because in his song, If I Were a Rich Man, what does he wish for? He wishes that he could be in that mansion of the mind. He wishes he was able to sit and study and think about things in a big way. But in reality, he lives in the slums. He's a dairy producer, and has to deal with life and everything that is happening in his town and with his people. And the thing that I think about, though, is the fact that when everything goes bad in Anatevka, in Tevye's town, even the people who have the ability to sit and study are now getting kicked out of Anatevka, right? Even the wealthy people of Anatevka, the people who don't seem to have any worries and don't want to deal with the slums, are ultimately impacted by the evil around them. So we all are subject to what's happening in the world. None of us can escape that except in our minds, maybe, but not in real life. And we all need to be concerned with the quote unquote slums, the regular people, the regular days, the regular towns, the regular folk, like all of us who have to deal with issues and questions and survive.
We are all in this together, though it is clear that some people do have the privilege of being in sturdier boats in the storm than others. I was interested, though, as you were sharing about Anatevka and Tevye, and I saw at the same time a comment come into the chat from Arlene. Can one ask the big questions and still be in the slums? That Tevye, even though he is trying to survive, still finds time to talk to God and still finds time to ask why. He doesn't necessarily get satisfying answers, but even in his position as not an educated man, certainly not a privileged man, he is not entirely divorced from these big questions either. There was a book found that I remember reading about that was a volume of Talmud discovered in some library that had been ransacked by the Nazis. And the volume of Talmud was stamped with the stamp that said something like, "For the Society of Woodchoppers who study Talmud." Something like that, right? This idea that even in these very, very poor shtetlach, among people who were just barely or not even surviving, they've still found time to engage in Gemara, which asks big questions about definitions and demonstrations. And so I think Heschel is starting us off by setting up a very clear binary. There are philosophers and there are prophets. And of course, it's going to get a little bit more hazy and murky as we go. But he does want us to get this idea that the prophets are certainly not the people who are divorced and separated from the realities around them. They are deeply enmeshed in the realities. They are living with the people, and they are the people. Josh, and then the Merowitzes.
Yeah, along the ivory tower analogy, it's very easy to say, this is how things should be done. This is what the world looks like. This is how the world operates, which is a hypothesis one can make, but unless you are with and among the people, and you are taking action, and you are on the ground with everyone to validate or invalidate a hypothesis like that, you're really doing nothing more than just sitting back and watching and hypothesizing without ever really knowing if that's right, if it's wrong, and speaks as well to the privilege too. It almost seems like a very crude scientific method where you've got hypothesis makers over here and experimenters down here, and ideally they should be coming together, and both do have merit. One is infinitely easier than the other.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Merowitz's.
Yeah. Just listening to some of the comments, it struck me. I think, especially, I want to go off a little bit of what Diane said, and a couple of other people whose name I can't quite read. That ethics and things like that, you can talk about philosophical concepts of ethics or justice, things of this nature, at a high level. But the people who live in the mansions, the question is, what obligation do they have to the people who are in the slums? The expression of ethics is carried out not by the philosophy, but by what you do every day with other people. And the cohesion of a whole society so that everybody is not killing each other, right, has to do with the fact that the people that are advantaged have some responsibility or duty that they recognize to help the people that are less advantaged for two reasons. One is that God in the Jewish conception is basically worried about the whole society, the nation of Israel, right? Rather than Joe Schmo and, Rabbi Akiva, right? And whether they're talking to each other, right? And whether, this person is up and this person is down. That problem is so vast. Nobody can understand it. Some people are going to be collateral damage, but in all, we are still Jewish. We are still here after so many thousands of years. And all these other societies, like the Romans that had great, mansions, and, the French nobility that had these great mansions while they were, let them eat cake to the masses, right? Those things happen because the top does not feel like it has any responsibility for the slums. And so I think that the boundary between good and evil, and justice and injustice, and ethics versus non-ethics is not determined by the philosophers. You can't understand that boundary until you see how the big shots and the little shots cohere as a society or fail to cohere. And when they fail to cohere, then the big shots are not going to save themselves. John F. Kennedy said, if a society in which the rich, there are few rich, but if there are many poor, the rich cannot save themselves. So I think that's what he's trying to say. He's trying to say ethics and morality and things, the prophets want to see what people really do when it comes to the quote stuff.
Where the rubber meets the road,
Right.
where the big ideas intersect with the real life. And the prophets, he says, are interested in that meeting between the Most High, God, and the most low, the most ordinary, the most potentially dirty and sorrowful and fragile and human. That's at that nexus point is where the prophet is interested in being engaged. Yeah, Luciana, then Alex, then we'll move on.
Yes, hi. Uh, so yeah, as a former academic, I got to the half of the chapter. So I saw him set up this big dichotomy, and I'm happy to hear that, later we're gonna see kind of more, I guess, nuance to this. But one quote that comes to my mind as we were talking here, I paraphrase it, that one cannot change what one cannot understand. So, in order to make difference on the ground and make a difference, um, yes, we can do a lot, but we can do a lot more if we understand the reasons for why things are happening the way they are in ways that are unjust or unfair. So I'm looking forward to moving forward in this conversation as far as the connection, right, between the practical and the more abstract.
Thank you. Alex.
Yeah, two different goals, two different professions entirely. The philosopher looks to explore, find out what is the good, try to reason one's way into ethics and morality and a sense of reality. The prophets already know. The prophet says, you know what's good. We all agree on that. You're not doing it. And as to whether or not whether we should be scandalized because the prophets consider trying to make us feel like the whole world's a slum, the prophets are pointing out the truth that as long as millions of people are forced to live in slums, to that extent, the whole world is a slum. It's just so much lipstick on a pig, so much beautiful hedge, over a sewer. So this is the role and the purpose of the prophets. They don't need to explore the meaning of the good. They don't need to explore what an individual owes to society, what society owes to an individual. It's been given. It is known. Need to be reminded. And that's a prophet's job.
There is certainly a moral clarity in these texts, and a rather ferocious moral clarity that says, as Alex says, it has been told to you already what is good. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. That's Micah. You already know. You already know. Seek justice. Now get to work on it. Stop talking and get busy. I'm turning back to the text. The things that horrified the prophets are even now daily occurrences all over the world. There is no society to which Amos's words would not apply. We're going to get our first quote from one of the prophets that we're talking about. Hear this, you who trample upon the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell our grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale, that we may make the ephah small and the shekel great. These are weights to be used in the marketplace, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell refuse as wheat. Amos, let's just get introduced to Amos for a moment. Amos is one of the so-called 12 minor prophets. Minor because they wrote shorter books than the three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Amos lives in the 8th century. He is said to be from Tekoa, which is a city in Judah in the south, though there are scholars who dispute where ancient Tekoa was, but he is a prophet in the northern kingdom of Israel. And he is directing his prophetic outbursts against the perceived corruption and social inequities of the northern kingdom, particularly in the cultic center in Beth El, in the place of money and privilege and religious and political power in the northern kingdom in the century before its destruction by the Assyrians. And this comment from the Israeli Bible scholar Ehud Ben Zvi: the book deals mainly with the malady of Israel, its condemnation, and the future restoration. When it condemns Israel, it repeatedly stresses social and political ills. So the book of Amos is really interested in the way that we are treating one another, as opposed to some of the other prophets of his same time, like Hosea, who is interested more in disloyalty to God. As expected in a prophetic book, meant to be read over and over, these are described in relatively general terms, making the critique applicable to different historical and social circumstances. So what we just read from Amos, one who would sell the poor for silver for the price of a sandal, is being couched in a sort of general condemnation of the mistreatment of the vulnerable, such that it can be read in its time and can be read beyond its time. It's thus not surprising, he writes, that a substantial number of readers in the 20th century consider it an inspiring source for their endeavors for social reform. The prophet Amos gets quoted pretty considerably in various different settings, ranging from among the early labor Zionist leaders like David Ben-Gurion, to the American Civil Rights Movement, to Latin American liberation theology. Amos is a favorite prophet, and he is the first prophet that Heschel draws our attention to, and the one we are going to see come up repeatedly in this essay. I'm going to read the quote again. Hear this, you who trample upon the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale? With that we make the ephah small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell the refuse of the wheat. So Amos is directing his ire at greedy merchants, making a profit on the most vulnerable, dealing deceitfully in false weights and measures, selling out the poor of the society. And Heschel's commentary picks up, indeed, the sorts of crimes and even the amount of delinquency that fill the prophets of Israel with dismay do not go beyond that which we regard as normal, as typical ingredients of social dynamics. To us, a single act of injustice, cheating in business, exploitation of the poor, is slight. To the prophets, a disaster. To us, injustice is injurious to the welfare of the people. To the prophets, it's a death blow to existence. To us, an episode. To them, a catastrophe, a threat to the world. Their breathless impatience with injustice may strike us as hysteria. We ourselves continually witness acts of injustice, manifestations of hypocrisy, falsehood, outrage, misery, but we rarely grow indignant or overly excited. To the prophets, even a minor injustice assumes cosmic proportions. I'll stop there. What is Heschel offering us in terms of critique of how we modulate priorities? He says the prophets experience the world as in a state of constant disaster, that the things that we are normally accustomed to seeing as just a matter of course are, for the prophets, a potential death blow to existence. What is the prophetic consciousness that Heschel is pointing us toward, asking of us? I'm going to read from the chat. In this passage, prophets seem to have an absolute sense of justice, rather than a utilitarian one. It's not about what is good for the greatest number. It's about what's good, period. And what's wrong is wrong, no matter what purpose it serves. Luciana says, it's meant to highlight complacency and indifference. The great heir of the prophets on this point is Elie Wiesel, who said repeatedly that the difference that we face, the challenge that we face in our society is not necessarily one of good versus evil, but rather one of good versus apathy. And that in indifference, that's when catastrophe strikes. It's not necessarily all about evil, though evil is real, as Elie Wiesel knew better than anyone, as someone who experienced Auschwitz knew to be true. But Auschwitz wouldn't be possible if it was solely dependent on evil people. It required the tacit cooperation of apathetic people. Beth says, when we grow accustomed to evil, we start to tolerate it. Like the frog that Beth, we were talking about earlier on, the frog being slowly boiled bit by bit by bit, and it doesn't notice until the jacuzzi is way too hot. Yeah, Sharon.
I was thinking the prophets managed to find exact symptoms for a general problem that people are so used to seeing the symptoms, they walk around not realizing how blind they are to them. And it doesn't matter if you're high or low in the world. You need to realize what is going on, that you just take, oh well, that's how it is. And their anger at it is an anger that everybody should have, instead of just settling for the status quo.
It's an anger, or even I want to say a confusion that little kids have, and that we socialize little kids out of. Little kids want to know how it could be that there could be someone who doesn't have a home. Gracie is so curious about that. How is it possible that there is a person who doesn't have someone to take care of them? She doesn't understand that at 5 years old. And how do we all get socialized to come to accept as a matter of course that there will be people in our midst for whom that is their reality? And how do we come to stop asking those questions that we all once asked when our moral compass was not dulled by the cumulative despair of the world? Yeah, Teresa.
It's funny, the line that sticks out to me is where he says, their breathless impatience with injustice may strike us as hysteria. And that got me thinking about like kind of the purpose or the function of the prophets. Like, if everybody's apathetic and the prophets are like overdoing it so much that it seems like hysteria, it's like the prophets are trying to prod us to doing something. It's like, I don't know if it's like prompting us to the same level of hysteria, but like, if everybody cared a little bit more, all of us would add up to the energy that we need to like solve all of this. It's like, I only look hysterical because I'm the only one saying something right now. Like, the prophets are the only ones kind of screaming about it and nobody else cares. But if me screaming about it gets all of you to care somewhat, then we'll all be caring and we'll all be acting and doing something about this. Because I was thinking too, like, you know, especially now and anytime, I guess, in the world where there's been like big goings on, it's impossible for everybody to care about everything all the time. Like we can't all be on high alert every second. We'd never get anything done. But like, it's the prophet's job to remind us that no, it is that serious. And by doing that, I guess like prodding us all to, as a collective, rising to that level. But it's not like, I don't know that it's like telling us individually to do that. It's like collectively we need to have this level of care. I don't know.
Yeah. And while we can't live in that place all the time, it would kill us. Need to have the capacity to go to that place when the time calls for it. Are we still able to lose our minds over in the moments when we have to? Are we still able to access our outrage? Or have we gotten so numb that we can't even find it in the most outrageous moments? We read last week from Heschel's telegram to Kennedy in 1963, in which he asks the president to declare a state of moral emergency. Are we capable of responding to moral emergencies? I just want to read a little further, then I'll turn to Carol. They speak as and act as if the sky were about to collapse because Israel has become unfaithful to God. Is not the vastness of their indignation and the vastness of God's anger in disproportion to its cause? How should one explain such moral and religious excitability, such extreme impetuosity? It seems incongruous and absurd that because of some minor act of injustice inflicted on the insignificant, powerless poor, the glorious city of Jerusalem should be destroyed and the whole nation go into exile. Did not the prophet magnify the guilt? The prophet's words are outbursts of violent emotions. His rebuke is harsh and relentless. And here's the key sentence. But if such deep sensitivity to evil is to be called hysterical, what name should be given to the abysmal indifference to evil which the prophet bewails? So that label of hysteria, you are responding disproportionately, you are responding over the top, you have lost your capacity to make sound judgment. If that's what we say toward those who are crying out, what label should we attach to those who are, quote unquote, normal, going about their business in an abnormal time? Carol. You're muted, Carol. Carol, you're saying brilliant things, but we can't hear them.
Sorry about that.
You're good.
I'm struggling, as I have in past conversations with you and in class. This is all, I love this, the passage from Amos and all, but if there's no consequences, then what is the point of the prophecy, and what is the point of like he says, for all of you who are doing this, and then maybe it'll come in the next passage that you didn't read to us, but like God will strike you down, or you will lose your business, or some kind of consequence. It's like when you're talking to a child and you say, don't do that behavior. If you just say, don't do that behavior, they're going to ignore you. Of course they are. If you say, don't do that behavior, I'm going to take away now these days, take away your iPad, or take away your phone, or you're going to go for a timeout. But there's never a consequence. And so what is to prevent the people these days, the people that most of us assume, think are doing so many bad things, there's no consequence. Well, so why shouldn't they continue doing these bad things?
Does anybody want to respond to that?
Oh, was Alex gonna say something? I'm not sure if somebody else is trying to talk. It's funny because whenever I babysit a lot and work with kids, and like something that I do a lot is, I like explaining why they have to do certain things. Because a lot of times, and I remember this from being a kid myself, it's like sometimes I don't want to do something because it seems pointless. Like, why? Why should I clean my room? Why should I go to bed? Why should I whatever? And I remember my parents telling me, like, you know, remember yesterday when you were in school and you were falling asleep? That's because you didn't go to bed. Did you like how that felt? Do you want that to happen again? And so it's consequences, but it's like, it's not like a punishment. It's more of a, this causes this, and I'm giving you the context so you know. And so I think like a lot of, you know, with whenever I think about social justice stuff, it's like people do need to know how something's going to affect them. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing, because we are interconnected. Like, it seems selfish to say, like, how is this gonna, what's in it for me? How is this going to affect me? But it does, because if you know, a big swath of our society is poor, is sick, is whatever, that's going to affect us, no matter how privileged or well protected we are. And so it's like, that is the consequence. It's like getting people to understand that, like, letting certain things go affects everybody, not just those people. It might take less time to get to us or whatever, but it will.
I have a thought.
Go ahead.
I don't know where my electronic hand is, so forgive me. I think the prophets understood. Well, first of all, I think Judaism spends a lot of time talking about that God, you know, when it comes to justice, you know, that's kind of God's domain. Like, I don't think the prophets felt that it was their domain to mete out justice, but I think their wisdom also came in their awareness that they could not cause people to think, do, or say things, that motivation had to come from within the person. And so I think the prophets are trying to poke our consciousness. They're trying to stimulate the parts of us that have maybe allowed ourselves to become indifferent, ambivalent, tolerant, to motivate ourselves to be better and to do better.
I was just reading, and with this, I'll bring it to a close for tonight, about a man who stood in Lafayette Park, right across from the White House. I was there with a group of our teenagers from CBI just last week, who stood in Lafayette Park with a lit candle every night for years during the Vietnam War. Just stood there with a lit candle, demonstrating for peace. And it said that people came to him and said, "How are you here month after month, year after year? Don't you know that nobody's paying attention to your candle?" And he replied back, "I came here to try to change them, but now I stay here so that they will not have changed me." I don't know if that's a true story. There's a version of that told as a midrash in a collection from Elie Wiesel about a man who stood outside of the city of Sodom with a similar sign protesting the wickedness of the city. And when people said to him, "See, you've been here, but nothing has changed," he said, "I came here to save their souls, and I stay here to preserve my own." I think there is something to being unwilling to go dead inside, even as we see the wicked be successful, even as we see the things we know to be right to be trampled on, to refuse to give in by normalizing it, by stopping feeling enraged about it, by stopping believing that something could be and should be different, is to grant a victory where it is not deserved. And so the prophets do say, and Amos does say, you keep acting this way and you're going to get destroyed. And 100 years later, it will come to pass, and the Assyrians do come and destroy the northern kingdom. But I think the way in which this text is eternal is that in every generation, we see a degree of brokenness and wickedness, and even we could call evil around us, that the majority seem to have become indifferent to. And Amos is offering a version of, and Heschel is lifting up a eternal truth, that there need to be the folks in the society who say, I'm not prepared to go along, even if they're not in the position to make the change. They're not willing to adjust to the brokenness. And so I think we're going to see, as we continue on in this essay, how prophets do that, how they figure out how to maintain their sense of this is not normal, how they communicate to others to try to bring others along with a sense that we need to collectively do better, and how we can internalize for ourselves a consciousness that is inoculated against the disease of apathy, because that's really the beginning of the end. When we can no longer feel, then we can no longer imagine a different kind of world. And when you can't imagine it, you can't make it. We'll end here. Thank you, everybody, and we'll come back together and look at some more Heschel next week. Please take care of yourselves.
Mommy.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Good night.
Yes, you too.